Greetings, citizens. Hey you beautiful creepy human being you. Welcome to my channel and welcome to today's true crime video. I'm so happy we could meet like this. I'm so happy that somehow in all of this that we're forced to deal with on the day-to-day, today you and I were able to find each other on this crazy little planet that we call home. My name is Brittany or Bratterstein, whichever you prefer, and today we're going to be discussing the tragic murder of 18-year-old Tessa Majors. But before we get started, if you have not yet had the pleasure, please make sure to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new video every single week, sometimes 2 a week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you, specifically you, but I can only do that if you join the Brat Pack and become one of us. One of us, one of us, one of us. Now, before we get into the story today, I need to say a quick thank you to the sponsor of today's video, and that's Dossier. And Dossier being a sponsor of this channel makes it possible. It very much helps in me being able to put out as many videos as I do, as consistently as I do. Now, if you are not familiar with Dossier, don't you worry, you're about to get familiar with Dossier. Dossier is a fragrance company, and you have heard me for the longest time now, if you've been here a while, sing the praises of Dossier and talk about how Dossier makes luxury scents at a fraction of luxury prices. Where most luxury perfumes can cost anywhere from $50 to hundreds of dollars, Dossier perfumes range from $29 to $49, and they offer bulk deals with up to 25% off and also free shipping when you buy 3 bottles or more. So they have tons of ways for you to save your dollar bills, y'all. And did you know that Dossier has branched out into another area of the scent market? Yeah, they're making candles inspired by some of their best-selling perfumes. And if you know me, you know I love candles. There are very few things I #treat myself with, but one of those things are candles. So I got this big old guy right here, and this is their candle called Floral Marshmallow. And it is an exact scent match for their perfume called Floral Marshmallow. Big surprise there. And their perfume, Floral Marshmallow, is inspired by the perfume by Kilian's Don't Be Shy. Yeah, by Kilian's Don't Be Shy, A Day perfume. And this candle, when I tell you, first off, I don't know if you noticed, because I've gotten their candles before, they like revamped them and now they're massive. Look how big this thing is. And it just smells so good. I mean, think about it. Floral Marshmallow. I want to lick it. I shouldn't. But I want to, but I shouldn't. But who knows what I'll do behind closed doors. I'm not gonna lick the candle. Don't lick your candles. But anyways, the point is I love how this smells. I actually do own this perfume. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I just have the feminine urge to smell exactly like my house so that anywhere I go is home to me. I know, so cheesy. That's assuming I ever leave my home. You know what I mean? But I'm very, very happy to have this. It is going to make this rainy season, this intense storm in California, just a nice cozy time in. I know all of that sounds great and I don't even really need to tell you more, but there is one thing about Dossier in particular, which is what attracted me to the brand in the first place and something that I always want to tell you guys, and that is that Dossier is a cruelty-free brand. And most perfume companies and candle companies, which Dossier is a fragrance company, so most fragrance companies that make candles and or perfumes are not cruelty-free. So if there's ever been a thing, a luxury scent that you've been wanting to try in either a candle or a perfume, you can do so with Dossier because the scents are exactly the same. Maybe even better in terms of staying power. Staying power. With all of that said, Dossier is offering members of the Brat Pack the opportunity to get 10% off their next purchase with Dossier by just using the code BRATTERSTEIN at checkout. If you click the link in my description box, it'll take you to the website and then you can pick up anything you want. A perfume, a candle, maybe getting 3 bottles of perfume so that you get that, deal on the shipping and the discount and all that jazz. I can't imagine a better deal you're gonna find, especially when you combine that with my code. So if you wanna save money and you loved things that smell bomb as heck, click the link in my description box and use the code BRATTERSTEIN at checkout to get 10% off your new favorite fragrance today. With that, I want to say one more thank you to Dossier for sponsoring today's video, and one more thank you to you guys for always being so supportive of all of my sponsors. You rock. Don't ever change. All right, now that I'm done spreading the good word of Dossier, we can go ahead and get into this video. Now, this video is on a case that I recently stumbled upon while researching another case, and it was a case that I had never heard of before. And I was actually surprised that I hadn't heard of it before because it is pretty recent. Tessa Majors was murdered in December of 2019. Tessa was in her first semester at an out-of-state college. Like, her parents had literally just dropped her off, like just recently dropped her off, so that she could follow her dreams in New York and make the life that she wanted, when she was killed while walking through a public park for absolutely no reason. It's incredibly sad, and once you learn what happened and who killed Tessa, you will just be like, what the, you know, like, it's just very upsetting, very pointless, and just sad, man. It's just sad. So today I'm going to tell you the entire story. I read all the things so that you do not have to. And at the end of this video, I want you to answer a question of the day. I'm going to give it to you now so you can have it knocking around in your head while we go through all the details. But at the end of the video, I'm going to revisit it. And the question of the day is this. What do you think could be done to prevent things like this? What could have been done to prevent what happened to Tessa? And what could be done to prevent this from happening to other people? Because I feel like with how tragic this is, there has to be some sort of takeaway here. Now, come gather around and let me tell you the story of the tragic murder of 18-year-old Tessa Majors. It all began on December 11th, 2019, when a security guard for Columbia University left his security booth to do his rounds. You know how security guards do be doing. He went all the way around, he came back to his security booth, and when he did, he found an 18-year-old girl. Obviously, this was Tessa Majors, and she was laying face down in a pool of her own blood. Quickly, he called the police, and when police arrived, they found that there was a trail of blood leading from Morningside Park, which was a park near the security booth, and it had gone all the way up this like massive flight of stairs and led all the way to where Tessa was collapsed. They could see that she was unconscious, but she was still alive, and she was kind of wheezing for breath, and she had lacerations on her face and several stab wounds to her body. So they're there doing everything they can to help her when she stops breathing, you know, so they start doing life-saving measures. They start doing CPR until the ambulance got there, loaded her in, and took her to Mount Sinai Hospital. But unfortunately, she succumbed to these injuries, and it was at this hospital where she was pronounced dead. Now, it was originally reported that Tessa had been attacked in Morningside Park by a group of 3 or 4 men. And that's a horrifying thought, to think of 3 or 4 grown men attacking this like small, petite 18-year-old girl. That's horrifying. But once you learned what had actually happened to her and who had done this to her, it was honestly somehow even scarier. But before we get into that, before we get into what happened to her and who was responsible, I first want to talk about who Tessa was as a person and who she was to those who loved her. Tessa Rane Majors was born May 11th, 2001, and she was born to parents Inman and Christy. And she was actually the niece of the University of Tennessee coach. I guess he's been a football coach for a really long time, Johnny Majors. Tessa was like her parents' world, you know what I mean? When I talk about the people who loved her, the first people to ever meet her and fall in love with her were her parents. They adored her. You can tell from all their statements that they did. And I read something that kind of got to my heart and just, you know, got me here. And it's that when she was a baby, they would dress her in this onesie that made her look like an astronaut. And her dad made up this song for her that he would sing to her when she would wear it. And this reminds me so much of my son, because me and my husband have lots of songs that we sing specifically to him, just because he exists and because he has inspired that within us to do, you know. And her father would sing her the song, and it would go something like, future baby, goes so good with biscuits and gravy. Hopefully someday in the future, all babies will be this good. Tessa was a super smart girl. She had attended a private school called St. Anne's Belfield School. Wow, my mouth does not work. And she graduated from that school in May of the year that she was murdered. And while going to that school, she was a really good student. She wasn't just good at like her classes, getting good grades, but she was also one of those like extracurricular kids who did things other than just like go to school and leave. She took part in cross country, she was in the creative writing club, and she even took part in helping on political campaigns. In Tessa's family's victim impact statement that they gave after she was killed, they said of her, and I quote, "She volunteered at the local animal shelter. She spent summers attending nature camp where she loved learning about the environment and the natural world around her. She loved meeting new people with different ideas and beliefs than her own, but mostly she loved her family and friends, her cats, and especially her younger brother. They were best friends, and his sense of loss is profound and indescribable. Tess was a friend to the friendless and kind in all the little ways that people remember forever." Tessa had just started attending college at Barnard College, which was a private all-girls college in Manhattan, and it was part of Columbia University, which is an Ivy League school. So she was, again, very smart. When Tessa was filling out her application to go to this college, she had to answer the question, like, why do you want to go to this particular college? And her response to this was, and I quote, "As an avid feminist, I have striven towards bridging my community gender divide by being outspoken in my classes, taking an intensive course on criminal justice, and campaigning for congressional candidate. I enjoy taking difficult classes and feel invigorated when forced outside of my intellectual comfort zone. I embrace the culture of positivity and growth at Barnard." In college, Tessa was planning on taking classes to become a journalist. Like, that's what she was interested in. And it was something that she'd been interested in a while. Prior to even going to college, she had been an intern for the Augusta Free Press. And while she was there, she had written like 4 articles. And this was something that was just kind of in her family's blood because her father was also a writer. And I believe at the time that she was killed, he had written 6 books. Chris Graham, which was the editor of the Augusta Free Press where she had taken her internship previously, said that Tessa was a natural journalist. Like, he thought she was going to be great at what she did. And he said that she also just cared about people and she wanted to use her writing to help people that she cared about and people who needed help. And he told People magazine that while Tessa was interning for them, she had chosen to write an article about this app that was being created to help people with disabilities. Because again, this was the kind of thing that she was interested in, was just helping others. And he said specifically of her, and I quote, "It's not fair that her life was snuffed out so senselessly. The tragedy beyond comprehension is that we will never know what she would have gone on to do." Graham added, quote, "She was gonna make the world a better place. She already was making the world a better place." Tessa just sounds like a really rad girl to me. Somebody who, like, in an alternate universe, in another life, I could have known, like, if we had been born around the same time. She reminds me of people that I did know, people that I do know that are just, you know, older versions of that idealistic 18-year-old. You know what I mean? She was also, like, interested in music. She played bass in a band that had actually just recently put out their first album. Not long before she was killed. It had 9 songs and it was called Girl Problems. And I actually did listen to it while I was researching her case, which was a very sad thing to do. But I did. The band was called Patient Zero and they had just recently played their first show as a band. Like, she had played shows before when she was in Virginia, but this was her first show that she had played with this band. And they also had 2 more shows lined up to play while she was at home in Virginia. Like, the band was starting to pick up steam and things were happening, but this wasn't the first time she had released music either. She also did solo songs, with her first release ever, as far as I know, being called Red Flag. And while she was on a sort of hiatus from Patient Zero, she played bass and sang backup vocals for another band called The Company. Tessa was said to be the type of girl who was bold and challenging, fearless, and disarmingly direct. She was the type of girl who would tell her friends that the strangest thing about them, the thing that they thought was the weirdest, was her favorite thing about them. Tessa loved wildflowers, and as a child she would actually, like, catalog all of the wildflowers in Virginia, in her home state of Virginia, and this love of flowers translated into her interest when she got older as well, because she was a photographer on top of all of the other things that she was. And she had done a art piece, photography piece, I'm not an artist, where it was called The Flower Collector. And she said of this art piece, this collection of photos, and I quote, "The flower collector contrasts the ephemeral nature of flowers and the natural world with the permanence of documentation via photography." And honestly, I looked at all of the photos in this collection and just, like, her photography in general, past just the flower collection. And that was, like, the saddest part for me. Even sadder than listening to her music was, like, looking at her photos. It just kind of broke my heart a little bit. She just seemed to be, like, a really good person. You know, like, that is the vibe I got. And for her to be killed, and to be killed in the way she was, is just so tragic. She was said to be the type of person who didn't understand violence or even being mean for the sake of it, and said that you should always expect the best from others, but it's okay to be disappointed when they're not kind. And this is who we're talking about today. This is who was stabbed to death in Morningside Park and left to die face down alone in the street. Now, Morningside Park. This park was not seen as a safe place. I believe in just the spring, if I remember correctly, in just the spring of the year that Tessa was killed, there had been like 17 robberies in that park, which was like a huge increase from the year before. And it was such a known dangerous place that was so close to the colleges that they often had like briefings letting the public know about the dangers of the park, and in the freshman orientation at Barnard College, they even had like safety precautions for that park as part of the freshman orientation. One student from France who actually did attend the same college that Tessa went to said that the school told them that like the park's generally okay during the day, but you need to be careful at night. Apparently Tessa's attack did prompt new security measures at Morningside Park, including 24-hour guarded booths outside the park, and the operation hours of the shuttle, like the bus that would go, like the nighttime bus, were extended so people would still have ride homes. There was also additional funding that was promised for security measures and for fixing outdoor lighting, but the locals weren't really convinced that this would actually happen because each crime in the park, each murder that took place in the park, because this wasn't the only thing that ever happened there, would bring new waves of promises of money and reforming the area and making things nice for everyone who was local. But as soon as like the interest in this particular crime or murder had passed, so had the promises to improve anything. Now, police are clearly investigating Tessa's stabbing as a murder because it's very clear that that's what it is. So they're doing what they do. Policing. They're canvassing the area. They're speaking to anybody to see if there's any witnesses. They're looking for surveillance video. They're doing all of that jazz. And they also make a statement to the public that they're looking into whether or not Tessa's murder could have been a robbery gone wrong. And they're looking to see if it's connected to an armed robbery that took place just days before Tessa's murder. Because again, robberies do be happening all over the place, all of the time in this park. And they also asked the public to come forward with any information and offer a reward right away of $2,500 for any information that could lead to an arrest and a conviction. Now, it did not take long for movement to happen on this case. Literally the day after Tessa was stabbed, the first suspect was arrested in connection with her murder. He was arrested when he was seen leaving his home the next day wearing the same clothes that he had been wearing at the time that Tessa had been attacked in the park. I guess what happened is that a description of the suspects was given to police, including the clothes that the people had been wearing and the shoes that the people had been wearing, because apparently it was very like distinct and identifiable. And they were able to get this because people had seen the attack and had seen these individuals fleeing right after she was stabbed. So they gave these descriptions to the police. And in addition to that, they also had surveillance footage that showed 3 suspects enter the park at the same time as Tessa and then book it right out of there after she was stabbed. And at the time that this person was arrested, he had a knife on him. Now, this suspect is taken in for questioning, and at the time that he's questioned, he does not have an attorney present, but he does have his uncle present. Now, you remember how I said that Morningside Park had a ton of robberies? Well, what's really crazy about these robberies is it turns out that most of them were committed by minors. Most of the people committing these robberies were kids between the ages of 12 and 14, and most of them were repeat offenders. Now, why am I bringing this up in this case? That's because the person who is in custody right now at the police, the person who is being questioned in the presence of his uncle, was a 13-year-old child. Okay? And he sits there and he tells police what happened. He tells them of his involvement and tells them that the people that were with him were 2 other kids, 2 other 14-year-old children. One named Luciano Lewis and one named Rashawn Weaver. Now, this 13-year-old boy's name is out there, but it is left out of the reporting a lot of the time because of his age and what his sentence ended up being. So I'm not going to say his full name. I will just refer to him as Davis because that is his last name and it's less identifiable than his first name, which is more distinct. So Davis is there with his uncle being questioned. And when his uncle hears him confess to what he did, he was shocked. He was very upset. I guess he was raised by his uncle after I believe his mom was killed. I think his mom was dead. And he was raised by his elderly uncle. And when he found out what he had said he did, what Davis said he did, he was shocked and he was like, I can't believe you did this. I didn't raise you to be like this. I didn't raise you to be a follower. And then when he had to leave, and he had to leave Davis there because he was being charged with felony murder at 13 years old, his uncle was like in tears and hugged him and was like, listen, I'll come back as soon as I'm able to. As soon as I'm allowed to, I will be here with you. Now, Davis did have an attorney, and his attorney asked that Davis be released from jail to be with his aunt and uncle while he awaited trial, and said that just because Davis was, quote, merely present at the time that Tessa was stabbed didn't mean he should be held in jail, because he did say he didn't take part in the stabbing, he had just been there when it took place. But the judge was like, no, I'm not going to do that. His admission to being there, his involvement in the crime is a good enough reason for him to be held in jail and not be able to go home. And on top of that, I think he has a high chance of reoffending. So no, he's going to be staying here. So he was held in jail, and he was held without bail. So now what police had to do was locate the other two boys, Luciano and Rashawn, and bring them in for questioning. And they did. They were able to recover them. They were able to bring them in for questioning. But when they denied involvement, police let them go because they were like, okay, we need to build a strong enough case to actually hold these kids, which is how it always should be, right? You should probably have a strong case before you're arresting people and putting them in jail, especially at this young age when, you know, you're essentially ruining their lives if they were not involved. And there's another reason that they were so proactive in making sure that everything was done right, that the case was handled perfectly. And this is because the area where this happened, the people who had lived there a long time were still pretty raw and pretty untrusting of police because of the handling of another famous case long before this one, but still fresh in everyone's mind. And this was the Central Park Five. Now, if you are unfamiliar, in 1989, a group of, you guessed it, 5 young men of color were arrested for the violent attack and rape of a white woman in Central Park. It's a really horrific case in itself, and I have been asked to cover it many times, and maybe I will. I have seen the comments about it. It is on my list, but that is not the case we're talking about today. The reason that it was relevant to this case, though, is because these 5 men were eventually cleared of all charges when it was found out that they were not at all responsible. And it was a very controversial case that put a lot of distrust in police and that case, and the feeling around that case and their feeling on police influenced how this case was handled, how officers treated suspects in the case, and how they, like certain things that you would think would be common knowledge, like police wouldn't rush to judgment and they'd make sure to video record, like have on video entire interrogations, things like that. So that's why they were like, okay, we don't have a strong enough case, we're gonna let them go and we're gonna build it, because they were like, we really don't need people accusing us of wrongly convicting young children of color again. So while police are doing that, they're putting together a case and making it strong, and they've got suspects in mind. Her family is just dealing with the trauma of losing their only daughter after dropping her off at school. Like, they had just dropped her off at school, you know what I mean? Like, you're expecting your kids to go off and better their lives, and instead she was literally murdered. And while this happens, they're not even in the same state. They're back at home in Virginia, so they're having to deal with all this and get to New York. Like, I cannot even imagine being in that position. Her family released a statement saying of Tessa, and I quote, "We lost a very special, very talented, and very well-loved young woman. Tess shone bright in this world, and our hearts will never be the same." 2 weeks after Tessa was murdered, her friends and her family celebrated her life at her former high school, and more than 1,000 people showed up, and they really delivered in the spirit of celebrating. There was dancing, poetry, and music, all delivered by her friends, because her parents felt like her friends and their passion and creativity will be how Tessa's memory will stay strong, which absolutely destroyed my heart. They sang songs that she loved and read poetry that she loved, or even poetry that she wrote herself. And the head of her former high school said of Tessa, and I quote, "This broad spectrum of people that Tess knew and whose lives she touched all are testament to the influence that Tess had on so many, an impact that will endure in sweet memories of our time with her." During this memorial, a video of Tess was played where she had been talking about music and talking about its effect on her and how songwriting and music helped her deal with like her big feelings inside her. And she said in this video, quote, "The world will benefit from hearing your unique perspective much more than it will from your silence." Now, Tessa's family did not speak at this memorial. I can only imagine how hard that would be, you know what I mean? So they kind of hung back and they watched, but they did pass out this pamphlet, and inside the pamphlet it had lots of stories of memories they had with Tessa, things they loved about her, and they also expressed their gratitude for the love and support they had gotten since they had lost her. I guess in the weeks after she was killed, because this was 2 weeks after, so in the days up until this day, a lot of Tessa's friends who were local were showing up at Tessa's parents' house. Yeah, Tessa's parents' house. And they had like a jam room, or like a room in the house where they would play music, like listen to music and actually play music the way that Tessa would as well. And this reminds me so much of being a teenager, because I had a friend's house that I would go to who had a room like this. And I feel like if they were in the position where they had lost him, that they would have wanted the exact same thing. So it just, again, I feel like I could have known her. It's just so sad, man. I mean, this girl was killed right before Christmas, like the week of Christmas, and her parents said that her absence was unrelenting. And it's just, I think about it and I'm like, how would you deal with that? Their only surviving child, who was best friends with her, now doesn't have his sister. Her parents don't have their daughter. Her grandparents, even her great-grandmother, outlived her. That's just not how it's supposed to be, and her family just has to live with that, and it weighs heavy on them. But they also said that they are thankful to not be alone in their time of grief, and said that, quote, Tess would have been surprised by this beautiful reminder of our shared humanity, end quote. Her loss was just one of those ones that when I read about it, that was the thing about it. Like, obviously the people involved was a big point that was like, wow, like reading about it, but just reading about her and how she affected people was even more so what I focused on. That's just why I've been talking about it for so much, because like she's the one who lost her life, and it was hard for so many people. Her college brought in counselors for people who needed help dealing with what happened, and the staircase where she had lost her life like quickly became a memorial, got covered in candles and stuffed animals, and the Sunday after she was killed they had a big candlelight vigil there where everyone went to remember her, and people are seen like crying and hugging each other, and you can see photos of this, and it was at night, and it's like there's just lights. It's like a sea of lights covering the staircase. The amount of people that showed out for this girl is just like insane. Now, back to the investigation. So the first kid is arrested. He tells police who to look for, but it takes 2 weeks before these kids can be arrested. And it seems like, wow, why would it be so hard to find kids? Well, it turns out there was some stuff going on. It turns out that Rashawn's family may or may not have been hiding him while the police were looking for him, because he had a wound on his hand, which we will get into when we get into what happened that day. And they were hiding him in various places across the city, kind of hoping to wait until that healed. He did eventually get brought in for questioning and all of that jazz, but the story about how that happened is a little bit, like, there's contradicting statements on how that happened. It was stated in like several places that while he was on his way to being questioned by the police, like he was on his way to the police station, either driving in a relative's car or his attorney's car, depending on what reporting you read, he literally jumped out of the car and took off. And there were reports that police were looking for him and that there were helicopters searching for him. But then one of the officers from the NYPD came out and was like, that actually wasn't true, that didn't happen. But I was like, then why did you report that you were searching for him with helicopters? Like, this is the kind of reporting that was happening like in real time, not something that people said after the fact. So I found that to be weird, and I just thought I would let you guys know in case you're familiar with this case and you're like, what about when he ran? Like, what about that? Well, this is what I'm telling you. Yes, yes. He did end up being arrested though after police released his photo to the media, essentially saying that there was a manhunt for this kid. He was spotted and eventually arrested in the lobby of his home, and after being arrested, he was released into the custody of his attorney while the investigation continued. But at this point, they still needed to find Luciano so that they could arrest him as well, but he too was hard to track down. They did end up getting lucky though, because Luciano decided to surrender and he voluntarily turned himself over to police with his attorney. So now all three boys are in custody, and it's determined that all three boys are responsible for what happened to Tessa, because based on the stories that they got from those involved, it was clear that if any one of them had not done their part in this crime, Tessa could have gotten away. So they were held, and the two 14-year-olds were going to be tried as adults. So they were charged with second-degree murder, and initially they both pled not guilty. So now let's talk about what the 13-year-old said happened that day, and a lot of what he said was corroborated by Luciano. On the evening of December 11th, 2019, just before 7 p.m., Tessa was walking through Morningside Park, and she had started to climb the staircase when she was attacked by Rashawn Weaver. Apparently all three boys, the 13-year-old Davis, Luciano Lewis, and Rashawn Weaver, had gone to that park, real quick, they were all in middle school together. They went to a middle school that was near the park. I feel like when I read that, like you hear 13, 14, yeah, then you hear middle school and you're like, Jesus, these are children. But anyways, the three boys who went to middle school together had apparently gone to the park with a plan to rob somebody. That was their whole point that day. Apparently they had actually followed another man into the park, but this guy was walking too fast and they couldn't keep up with him. And then they saw Tessa and decided, hey, we'll just go rob her instead. According to Luciano and Davis, Rashawn Weaver saw Tessa, ran up to her and kicked her really hard in the back, saying to her, quote, "Give me your money, run your pockets, I'm not playing. And she looked at him and was like, are you like seriously trying to rob me? Like she didn't think, she was just like kind of blown away that this was actually happening to her. It was said that Tessa tried to run, and at the point that she did, the 13-year-old actually ran over to her and knocked her to the ground. At that point, Rashawn Weaver and her started to scuffle, and Luciano stood by and stood watch while they were on the ground wrestling with one another. And he said at some point during this altercation, during the scuffle, she looked up at him and called him a coward. It was after that that both Rashawn and Luciano attacked her at the same time. Luciano was holding her in either a headlock or like a bear hug so that she couldn't escape, while Rashawn started trying to dig through her pockets and was telling her, like, give me what you have, give me your money, empty your pockets, give me your phone. And she flat out refused. She's like, you are not getting my phone. Like, this is my lifeline. And her family said that they believe the reason she wouldn't give up her phone is because inside her phone, it had all of her songs that she had worked on for years, and music was so important to her, and she didn't have them stored anywhere else, so she would not let them go. This fight went on for what seemed like forever for her. Like, it only lasted a minute, but if you think of like an entire minute of 3 men, because even though they were younger than her, they were all larger than her because she was like a tiny little girl. 3 men attacking you all together, trying to take your stuff. You're fighting with them. It must have felt like forever for her. So she's fighting with them. She actually gets away from them twice, but they pursue her and surround her again. Tess screamed for help. She screamed out into the void of the park, like, help, I'm being robbed, like, help me, these people are robbing me. And while that's happening, she's still fighting with the boys, and she ends up biting Rashawn in the hand. Remember that wound that he was being hid for so that you wouldn't see it? You remember, that wasn't a good sentence, but you know what I'm talking about. She bit him down on the hand hard enough to draw blood. And in response to this, he stabbed her. He stabbed her 4 times in the chest with enough force that feathers flew out of her jacket, and one of these 4 stab wounds pierced her heart. When she was incapacitated and on the ground, the boys then dug through her pockets before somebody was coming. Like, Luciano saw a witness and was like, oh, we gotta go. And the other 2 boys had to physically grab Rashawn and like pull him off of her, and they all ran. A stabbed Tessa then attempted to complete the climb up that staircase, making it to the top. And she ended up making it to a city bench, actually, where she tried to get an Uber. Like, she was trying to get help before she collapsed. That's when she was found by the security guard at the top of the staircase and was still conscious enough to tell the guard what had happened to her before passing out and being rushed to the hospital, where she was pronounced dead. Isn't that just so fucked up, right? Like, it's just pointless, and it's sad, and it wasn't even the plan. Like, they knew they were going to rob somebody, and they knew there was a knife, but they didn't plan to use it. I guess at some point during the day, the knife that they had gotten dropped, and the 13-year-old like picked it up and gave it back to Rashawn. And it's just like, what would have happened if they didn't know that the knife fell and they hadn't picked it back up? You know what I mean? Like, what would have happened if that knife hadn't been there? Like, this would not have happened. It's just because they had that as an option. And on the note of how horrible this is and how young these kids are, because that's the thing, is they're all just kids doing dumb shit. You would think that, and I say dumb shit, like murdering someone is dumb shit. Obviously, it's more serious than that. But when I think about it, I'm just like, my brain can't even compute it. And you would think doing something this terrible, knowing you had killed somebody, would, traumatize you a little bit as a child. It would thwart your future plans to continue committing criminal activity, right? Nope. At least not in Rashawn's case. He did not learn. After Tessa was killed, but before he had been arrested, he and 3 friends, I believe they were 3 different friends, beat and robbed a man on Valentine's Day 2020 in East Harlem. Rashawn was wearing a ski mask and went up to the guy to ask if he could buy weed, and then him and his friends chased the man down, pummeled him in the head and face, and then stole his cell phone, his money, and his shoes. And the victim ended up suffering 2 black eyes and bruising to his nose and cheeks. This same day is when he was arrested and charged with Tessa's murder. And for the record, because I don't want to forget to mention it, when it comes to this robbery that happened on Valentine's Day, he does end up confessing to this and pleading guilty to this, as well as another robbery that happened right before Tessa was killed, where a man was robbed by Rashawn at knife point and his phone was stolen. So he did plead guilty and got charged for these as well, but I don't think I'm going to mention it later, so just so you know. Now, it does seem, at least in Rashawn's case, that this is a bit of learned behavior, something that he picked up by and from the adults that were in his life. And this is not to give him an excuse for what he did, but maybe to just explain how it is that we got here. Because apparently, like, his parents weren't super great, right? His dad, his name was Clifford, he was in and out of jail a lot. He was in jail for things like possession of a controlled substance and second-degree robbery. And each time that he was arrested, he was released, and then each time he'd go right back in. And this is where he was at the time that he was arrested, because in 2017 he was arrested again on parole violations for some drug charge. So he was in jail. And this is where he was when he was on the phone speaking to his son Rashawn on a recorded line. And it was during this phone call that police got some very interesting information that could help them then prosecute Rashawn for Tessa's murder. Rashawn was recorded telling his father that he had been in the park that day and that he had tried to steal a girl's phone and she had refused, and that she had hurt him, so he had hit her with the knife. That's the way that he said it, because he's a kid, because he's a child. I hit her with the knife like that. I stabbed her to death is what you did. And that wasn't all they had against him. They also had the testimony of the other two kids involved that lined up, and they had DNA. Some of Rashawn's DNA was under Tessa's fingernails from the attack. Now, this case was very talked about. It was very highly publicized, at least locally, I think in a big part due to who the victim was and who her killers were. And it brought out a lot of really horrible people, a lot of really shitty racist people, as I'm sure you can imagine. And it's always really fucking frustrating to see. Both Bernard and Columbia College reported receiving, quote, abhorrent and viciously racist, end quote, robocall messages from a white supremacist organization, and a man in Connecticut that I believe was related to these calls ended up being arrested when he posted online that he was going to kill one of the kids who had stabbed Tessa. It was just a big mess, and this case ended up getting, like, what happened to Tessa ended up getting kind of muddled in all of the bullshit that came after. It was referred to as a political football, and there was a lot of talk about not wanting this to sully the fact that, like, crime had been on the decline in New York prior to this. There was a lot of talk around that, which is like, okay, but this still happened, so what is your point? And they were kind of like, well, my point is that though the crime in this particular park has been on the rise, I see there's been a lot of robberies, don't you worry, the rest of New York is safe, so maybe just stay out of the park. Additionally, there was this man named Ed Mullins, who I believe was the leader of the police's union, if I remember correctly. Well, he started speaking out, and he was kind of criticizing the mayor, basically saying that the mayor had been decriminalizing smaller crimes, quote, minor crimes, like weed, for example, and that Tessa had been in the park to buy weed. And basically what he was saying is, if she hadn't been in the park to buy weed because you were buckling down and prosecuting people for selling weed more effectively, then she would not have been killed. People were pissed about the way he spoke, particularly Tessa's parents, because basically what he was saying was that, well, basically the way they were taking it was that Tessa was essentially being blamed for her murder, that if she hadn't been in the park buying weed, none of this would have happened to her. And they didn't appreciate that. And the mayor called what he said heartless and, like, irresponsible, and said, like, we don't victim shame in New York. And the mayor said specifically of losing Tessa and of Tessa's murder, and I quote, "We've lost a young woman full of potential in a senseless act of violence. I want every student and every member of faculty to know your city will be with you in the days ahead." Now, this guy, Ed Mullins, did come out later. Well, when I say he came out, he tweeted later saying that he wasn't trying to blame Tessa for her own death, and that really his stab was more at the mayor because the mayor was turning New York into a cesspool, and said that the mayor should essentially be ashamed of himself. And I don't know, man. To me, it just feels like a lot of people trying to use a tragedy like this to push their own agendas, and putting all the attention on the things that they find to be important instead of Tessa, who is the person who lost her life. Because let's be real, the issue in this particular case is not weed. I don't even smoke weed. And I can say that decriminalizing weed won't stop people from stabbing people in the park. It won't stop kids from having access to knives and a lack of supervision and poor role models. And it won't stop violence. That's got to be handled in a different way. But okay, guy who does not like to party. Anyways, let's get into what happened to Tessa's murderer, starting with the 13-year-old kid. Now, Davis ended up pleading guilty to robbery in the first degree in family court, and Tessa's family was not happy about this. They were not happy that the 13-year-old ended up getting a plea deal where essentially if he pled guilty to this robbery charge in family court, the murder charge would be dropped. They didn't think that it was fair. They said that this kid showed no remorse for what happened to Tessa, and that if he had not picked up and handed that knife to Rashawn in the first place, that none of this would have happened. They were also upset that in the plea agreement, they felt that it was written in such a way that what actually happened was sort of masked, that they purposely avoided using the word like murder, where if you were to read this, it would sound like she died in some sort of accident. They didn't like that, and they didn't like the way the defense had essentially downplayed this child's involvement in Tessa's murder. The consideration for offering him the deal at all said to come after reviewing the surveillance tape, which showed to them there was nothing on the surveillance video that showed this child touching Tessa at all, and that, and combined with his age and the fact that he had a clean record, were all things that were taken into consideration before offering him this deal. So he sat there wearing a green t-shirt and a blank face as he was told that he was going to have to serve 18 months in a detention center. And when I say have to serve, I mean that that's his sentence, but his minimum is 6 months in a secure facility, and after that he can be released, but with supervision. Though Tessa's parents were not present at this hearing because they did not show up, their victim impact statement was read. And it said in part, and I quote, "We dropped her off at Bernard College in New York to begin her freshman year of college. 100 days later, we brought her home to Virginia in an urn." Now, next in line was Luciano Lewis, and he definitely downplayed his involvement in the crime. He said that he didn't even know that Tess had been stabbed, let alone murdered, until the next day when he saw it on the news that somebody had been killed. And he said that it wasn't his plan or his idea to commit the robberies in the first place, that it was Rashawn's, and he was just going along with it. He ended up pleading guilty to second-degree murder and first-degree robbery, and this plea was appreciated by Tessa's family, unlike with Davis's plea. They were like, listen, I am okay with this. This is not, I mean, obviously none of this is what I want, but this is much better than you did the first time. And I believe that they were present at Luciano's hearing, because I saw some photos and I noticed something in looking at these photos of her parents. And in the photos that I believe were taken at Luciano's hearing, her mother was wearing this black scarf, like this big, kind of like a shawl that had red stars on it. And I recognized it because I had been looking at Tessa's Instagram, obviously, just trying to get an idea of who she was when I was researching this case. And I saw that Tessa had photos wearing that as well. So I think she was wearing her daughter's scarf to the hearing. And that was just one of those notes that got me in my heart. During his hearing, Luciano did make a statement on his own behalf where he said as a human, he was embarrassed and he was ashamed for the part he took in committing this crime. And he said that he was there to take his punishment like a man, I guess, and knows and knew at that time that there was nothing he could do that could make anything better. And he actually spoke directly to his father during his statement saying, and I quote, "Dad, I'm sorry I failed you and became less human, less than the son you raised." Now, the judge heard Luciano say all this and was like, that's all fine and well. Like, what you're saying is really sweet and great. And like, those are the things, you're saying the things that one should be saying. However, your words and your actions since being in jail awaiting trial aren't quite lining up, my guy. And then the judge went on to cite the quote, multiple violent acts Luciano had committed since being in jail awaiting his trial. It was reported that he had been in several fights since being in jail, that he was rearrested for assault after he slashed somebody over a pillow, and that he had beat another prisoner with like a pipe in a sock. The judge was like, listen, it's really, really sad. It's sad that you did this, and it's sad that even after being arrested and facing these consequences and learning how bad what you did was, you've changed nothing about yourself. And prior to sentencing him, the judge said to Luciano, and I quote, "I agree that one bad choice, even one horrific choice, standing alone, should not prevent leniency in the case of a young offender. But the defendant has demonstrated in a year and a half since this terrible incident that this is not an aberration." In the end, Luciano Lewis was sentenced to 9 years to life in prison for the murder and 3 additional years for the robbery, which essentially means that he has to serve 9 years, and after that, a parole board will determine when he is eligible for release. Now, the last person to be sentenced for Tessa's murder was Rashawn Weaver, and Rashawn Weaver actually had a notable attorney that led me down a little bit of a rabbit hole. So Rashawn's dad was able to speak to Jeffrey Lichtman, L-I-C-H-T-M-A-N. And this man was the attorney for a man named Joaquin Guzman, otherwise known as El Chapo. And if you don't know who El Chapo is, he was known as pretty much the most powerful drug trafficker in the world. And now his attorney was going to be Rashawn's attorney, and Rashawn's father had convinced him to take on the case pro bono, so he wasn't going to have to pay for these services. And I just thought that that was wild, that like Rashawn's attorney was El Chapo's attorney when El Chapo's case was such a big case. You know what I mean? I mean, here's the thing. I mean, El Chapo was in jail, so is that like a good thing? I don't know. I don't know enough about that case to know like if his attorney was good or if there's just that much evidence against him. I mostly know about El Chapo based on things that my friends have told me that know more about him. But he was said to be like a pretty shitty dude. Like, not a good guy. But anyway, on top of that, one more important thing or like notable thing to me when it came to Rashawn's attorney is that this man had twin sons that were the same age as Rashawn, like around the same age. So he would bring his sons to like court with him while he did this case because he wanted his sons to see how the legal system treated people, even people their age. And he just said that in having sons the same age as Rashawn, to see a kid that age being up for life in prison, it made him like physically ill. Anyways, the trial happened, right? And Rashawn's attorney asked the judge if Rashawn could be like taken out of his handcuffs, and the judge was like, no. And I just wanted to tell you guys because I was like, damn, like the thing is he's just so young. They're just so young, so it's hard for my brain, like, to wrap my head around. Obviously, it makes me sad because they're kids. It obviously makes me much more sad that Tessa's literally gone forever, and that is unforgivable. But when you think about how young they are, it's just like, damn. Can't be taken out of handcuffs because you literally are a criminal and you're in jail for stabbing a girl to death. But anyway, he ended up pleading guilty to second-degree murder, first-degree robbery, and second-degree robbery. And in making his plea and like pleading guilty, he said that he did intentionally cause the death of Tessa Majors by stabbing her to death with a knife. His attorney did try to make the point that he had a hard life, that he was in horrible circumstances with no parental supervision, and that's how he ended up the way that he was. And that must have been hard because his mother was actually in court when this was said, so it must be hard for her to hear like that he turned out this way because essentially her and his father like sucked his parents. That's got to be very hard to hear, but I mean, if it's true, it's true. You can't take it back. You just have to deal with the fact that that's the repercussions of the actions, right? I don't know a ton about his family life, but the stuff that I did read wasn't great. The prosecution responded to this kind of like, yeah, you know what, maybe you're right, maybe it's true, maybe he had shitty parents and shitty role models, so he ended up a shitty little person, but that doesn't change what happened. It doesn't excuse him of what happened for what happened, and it doesn't change or excuse what he's done since then. Because apparently since being in jail, he continued getting in trouble. After Tessa was murdered, he continued committing crimes. Even once he was in jail, he got in trouble for weapons and drugs, and he was said to have attacked counselors on more than 10 occasions. And the prosecutor was like, look, he's shown no remorse, and he clearly didn't feel bad for what he did to Tessa, because right after killing her, he recorded a video of himself where he was, holding the bag and smoking the weed that he stole from her. Rashawn did read from a prepared statement where he said that he was embarrassed and ashamed of his thoughtless and immature actions, and said that he felt bad, that he felt like Tess should have had a long life, and he's sorry that because of him, she doesn't. He also said specifically, quote, I never set out to harm her, and I would give anything to go back in time so that it never happened. Nothing I say or do for the rest of my life will make up for the harm and pain I caused. And then he said thank you to his family for supporting him when everyone else in the world hated him. Now, I won't say that that's not sad to me, because it is. It's sad to consider how young 14 actually is. When you really think of who you were, if your parents, who your kids were at 14, That's very sad, but it is not as sad as what happened to Tessa. It's not as sad as the fact that in court they played the video of her final moments and her father had to get up and leave the room because he couldn't take it. And as they showed this video of Tessa's final moments alive, the prosecutor narrated what was happening for what I imagine was dramatic effect. The prosecutor said during this video, quote, "She's struggling up the stairs now. She has minutes left to live. She does not realize at this point why she is lightheaded or why she's dizzy or why she can't walk or why she can't stand or why she's about to fall. And she will get to this lamp pole and collapse. And she will die, face down on a dirty New York street at the hands of the defendant and 2 others." Her family did make a statement, and it was incredibly heartbreaking to read. They were basically making this statement while trying to talk about what Tess would think, how Tess would feel about what was happening, and what her opinion would be about what happened to her. So I'm going to let you know now that it's painful, but they said of this, quote, "This is a victim impact statement. The victim is Tess Majors. Tess Majors cannot say how being murdered impacted her because she is dead. She is dead forever and will not be coming back. The family of Tess Majors does not know what Tess would say at this moment about being murdered by Rashawn Weaver. They have no idea what it's like to fight for an iPhone for the simple matter that it contained 3 years worth of songs she's written. Songs she was planning to record over the winter break, which was only a week away. They have no idea what it was like to stumble up a long flight of stairs after being stabbed multiple times in the chest, her phone still in her hand." That statement to me is just super sad because it really paints a picture of what happened to her, and it shows that her family is very, very aware of what happened to her, and that has to be incredibly difficult to know and to be able to do nothing about. A friend of hers did come out, speaking of what Tess would say and how she would feel when it comes to what happened to her, a friend of hers did come out saying what they thought, and when I read it, it rang true to me based on what I read about Tessa as a person and who she seemed to be. And her friend basically said, if Tessa was asked what justice would look like for her when it came to this case, Tessa would want justice for Tessa wouldn't just be punishments for the kids who took her life, but it would be answers to the question, why were those kids out there robbing people in the first place? And that is a very valid question. That is a question that should be explored and is the greater issue when it comes to this, not weed guy who tweeted stupid shit. It's why were these kids out there doing this in the first place? But we don't have all the answers to this, and we can't change it. It happened, and now this is where we are because of it. Now, the DA recommended that Rashawn be given 15 years to life in prison, but ultimately he was given 14 years to life in prison. And Rashawn says that he wants to be more than a statistic, and he's going to use his time in jail to continue to learn and grow and prove to everyone that he can be a better person. The prosecutor said of this sentence, and I quote, 14 years to life is a long sentence, but at the end, Rashawn Weaver goes home. Tess never will. Now, just because I read this and I thought it was sweet and I would like to leave this video on a happier note, I read something that I thought was it touched my heart a little bit, and it's kind of a how is Tess being remembered segment. And basically there was this place. It was called the Southern Cafe and Music Hall, and it's a place it was in Virginia, and it's a place that Tess had played shows, live music, before she was killed. Basically, lots of musicians had passed through there, and they have an area on the wall where they hang photos of famous musicians who have played at that location. And after learning what happened to Tessa, they said that they planned to hang a photo up of her there as well. I just wanted to tell you guys that because I wanted to end this story on a more positive note. But with that, that is the story of the murder of 18-year-old Tessa Majors. Isn't it just so sad? It breaks my heart. It really does. But I do want to thank you guys for hanging out and remembering her with me today, because she seems like a person that is special and worth remembering. I hope you found this case interesting and informative, and it gave you everything you would want when looking into this case. And now that you've heard all of the details, I want to revisit the question of the day, and that was this. What do you think can be done to prevent things like this from happening? What could have been done to have prevented Tessa's murder? Because it seems like something has to be taken away from this, because it's just so sad and so pointless and so wrong, and it's hard for my brain to wrap around it. So let me know all your thoughts in the comments below. But anyways, guys, before you leave, please don't forget to leave your suggestion on what case you'd like to see me cover in the comment section below. Every time you leave a suggestion, I put it on my list with your name next to it so I can give you a shout out if I cover it. I love looking into the cases you guys are interested in because you usually recommend cases that need more coverage or cases I've never heard of before. And I know you're filled with good ideas and good taste, otherwise you would not be here. If you haven't already, please don't forget to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing the bell. I put out a new video every week, sometimes 2 a week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you, specifically you. And if you want to hang out more consistently, all my social media is listed down below for your convenience, along with the link to my merch store. This is not my merch. And the link to my membership where you can get early access to videos that are not sponsored, live streams, and things like that. I want to say one last thank you to Dossier for sponsoring today's video and making it possible for me to put out as many videos as I do as consistently as I do. And I want to thank you guys for being so supportive of all of my sponsors. You rock. Don't ever change. And now with all of that said, I just want to thank you for being here when you could literally be anywhere else in the world. That is tight. You are tight. Please stay safe and be a better person than you were yesterday. And I hope to see you in my next video. Bye.